The conveyor at Baldwin Hardwood Sawmill fed another oak plank through the edger, and the offcut dropped onto the reject pile with a hollow clatter, one more short board joining a stack that had grown taller every week that fall. Ruth Miller stood at the edge of the yard, watching a front loader push the pile back to make room for the next batch, the machine's diesel engine drowning out most conversation. "Careful walking through there," the yard manager said, a broad-shouldered man named Wade who'd run the mill floor for going on 20 years. "That pile's mostly good oak, believe it or not. Just wrong lengths for anybody buying from us." Ruth picked up the nearest board, 18 inches, maybe less, solid and heavy in her hand. Tight grain, a little knotty near one end, but sound clear through. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing's wrong with the wood," Wade said. "Everything's wrong with the length. Our regular buyers want 6, 8, 10-foot boards, standard widths, nothing shorter than 4 feet as a rule. This is all the trim off, 18 inches up to maybe 4 feet, mixed widths, the occasional knot or check. We can't move it. 40 tons of it sitting out here right now, and it just keeps growing." "What happens to it?" Wade shrugged. "Firewood dealer takes some. Rest goes to the chipper eventually, or it just sits until we run out of yard space and somebody makes us deal with it." Ruth turned the board over once more, feeling the weight of it, the density that only came from real hardwood grown slow. "I might be interested in a load." Wade looked at her the way people usually did when she said something like that. "You want the reject pile?" "Ma'am, I've had contractors laugh me off the phone over that pile. It's short lumber. Nobody builds anything standard-sized out of 18-inch oak." A younger mill hand stacking scrap nearby overheard and laughed outright, not unkindly, more surprised than mean. "You gonna glue 18-inch boards into something? Good luck with that." "I'm not building anything standard-sized," Ruth said, and left it at that. Ruth was 41, raising Emma, 15, and Jack, 10, on 80 acres that kept her busy enough most seasons without adding new projects. But she'd been trying to expand her seedling and propagation operation that year. More bench space for starting trays, more room to grow young stock before it went into the ground or out to buyers, and the commercial nursery bench systems she'd priced out ran well beyond what the expansion was worth to her. What she needed was simple in principle. Sturdy, rot-resistant surfaces, raised off the ground with decent drainage and airflow underneath the trays. What she had, staring at that reject pile, was 40 tons of solid oak that happened to come in the wrong shape for anyone else's purposes. She hauled the first load home over 3 trips with the truck and trailer, stacking it under the lean-to beside her equipment shed, the same spot where she'd sorted lumber more times than she could count. Sorting took the better part of a week. Emma helped most afternoons, measuring and calling out numbers while Ruth worked through the pile board by board. Some of it wasn't worth keeping. Boards with deep checks running end to end, cracks that would only widen with weather, went aside for firewood. A handful had rot at one end where they'd sat too long against damp ground before Ruth ever got there. A few were structurally unstable, twisted enough that no amount of clamping would hold them flat. Ruth set those aside without much debate. What remained, a solid majority of the load, was short, sound oak. Tight grain, decent strength. The occasional knot or live edge that didn't compromise anything structural. Not lumber in any conventional sense, but not waste either. Her first idea seemed obvious enough. If the boards were too short to use as they were, she'd join them, splicing short pieces end to end with cleats and glue to create longer, continuous bench tops, the same length and function as a standard piece of lumber, just built up out of scraps instead of cut from one long board. She spent 2 weeks building her first prototype that way, a run of 8-foot bench tops assembled from short offcuts, joined into continuous surfaces, mounted on a simple frame in the corner of her greenhouse. It looked, honestly, pretty good. Smooth, solid seaming, and from a few feet away you'd never have guessed it was built from anything but standard lumber. She loaded it with seedling trays and started her regular watering routine, the same as she would on any bench, and for the first couple of weeks, nothing seemed wrong. Then the real trouble started. Repeated watering, day after day, began to tell on the joints where short pieces met. The glued splices, exposed to constant moisture from above and limited airflow underneath the solid surface, started to swell unevenly, some boards cupping slightly while their neighbors stayed flat. Water that should have drained straight through began pooling in the low spots where the cupping was worst. In one section, a cluster of trays sat over a patch of bench that had gone nearly flat instead of gently sloped, and Ruth started losing seedlings there to root rot before she understood why. She pulled up a section of the bench top one wet morning and found the problem laid bare. The joints had swollen and separated just enough to trap water instead of shedding it. Airflow underneath was uneven, blocked in spots by how tightly she'd built the solid surface. She'd spent 2 weeks trying to make short boards behave exactly like long ones, and the wood had simply refused to cooperate once real growing conditions got involved. Her assumption, looking back, was straightforward enough to name. She'd figured that to make short oak useful, she first had to make it act like long lumber, joined into continuous, standard-length surfaces. It hadn't occurred to her that the length limitation itself might not be the problem worth solving. She drove out to see Carl Whitmore the following week, a long-time commercial nursery grower, 2 counties over, who'd been running greenhouse and outdoor propagation benches on a real production scale for going on 30 years. She brought a sample section of her failed benchtop along with her. Carl looked it over for a long minute, running a thumb along one of the swollen joints. "You built this to look like one solid board," he said. "That's the instinct most people have, coming from carpentry. But a nursery bench isn't furniture. It's infrastructure that gets wet every single day and needs to drain fast, breathe underneath, and let you fix or swap out a bad section without tearing the whole thing apart." He walked her through his own bench setup, rows of standardized slats mounted across a simple frame, small consistent gaps between each slat for drainage and airflow, every slat interchangeable with any other of the same size. "Doesn't matter if the surface is one continuous piece or 40 little pieces," Carl said. "What matters is water moves through it, air moves under it, and when one piece fails, which it will eventually, you replace that piece in 5 minutes instead of rebuilding the bench." Ruth stood there for a moment, looking at her own failed prototype in a new light. She'd been trying to hide the fact that her material came in short pieces. Carl's whole system was built around the idea that short, standardized, replaceable pieces weren't a compromise at all. They were the actual design principle a working nursery bench depended on. She went home and started over completely, this time working with the short lengths instead of against them. Rather than joining boards into continuous surfaces, Ruth sorted her oak offcuts into consistent slat sizes, 18 inches, 24 inches, 30 inches, grouping the pile by length and width into categories. Emma tracked in a new notebook a running tally of how many usable slats came out of each size class. The frame underneath stayed simple and repeatable, evenly spaced crossbars sized to standard measurements, so any slat from a given size category would drop into any matching frame without custom fitting. She left real gaps between slats this time, a 1/4 inch or so, enough for water to drain straight through and air to move freely underneath instead of pooling against a solid surface. The first small prototype went up in her greenhouse on a single frame section, loaded with seedling trays, and watered on the same aggressive schedule that had ruined the earlier version. This time, water passed straight through the gaps. Airflow moved freely beneath the trays, nothing pooled, nothing cupped unevenly, because nothing was fighting to behave like something it wasn't. Carl put Ruth in touch with a regional nursery operation, looking to expand its propagation space that spring, and after seeing her working prototype, the operations manager agreed to test a batch, roughly a dozen bench units, through a full growing cycle before committing to anything larger. "We're not ordering 50 of these off one demo," the manager told her plainly. "We'll run these through a season, real watering schedules, real plant loads, and see how they actually hold up." Ruth delivered the dozen units in early spring, built from her sorted, standardized slats, mounted on the repeatable frame design. Over the following weeks, the nursery crew loaded and reloaded trays, ran their normal watering routines, hosed the benches down for cleaning between plant batches, and generally put the material through the kind of daily wear a prototype rarely survives gracefully. About 6 weeks in, one slat on a heavily used bench developed a crack running most of its width, the kind of stress damage that happens eventually to any wood under constant wet-dry cycling. A crew member flagged it to the nursery manager, expecting, reasonably, that it might mean pulling the whole bench out of rotation. Ruth drove out that same week with a handful of replacement slats from her sorted stock. She pulled the cracked piece, dropped a matching slat into the same frame slot, and had the bench back in full use in under 10 minutes. The nursery manager watched the whole exchange without saying much, but he brought it up specifically when he called Ruth a few weeks later. "That's the part that sold me, honestly," he said. "Not that the wood held up. Wood always eventually cracks somewhere. It's that when it did, fixing it didn't cost us a bench." He placed an order for 30 more units that summer, the first real order Ruth had gotten beyond the initial test batch. Growth after that came steadily rather than suddenly, the way most things did on Ruth's farm. Word passed between growers the way it usually did in that part of the state, one nursery mentioning it to another at a supplier meeting or a farmer's market stall. Over the following 2 years, Ruth built and delivered 118 benches to 6 different operations, each order sized to what that particular grower actually needed. Nothing oversold, nothing rushed past the point where she'd tested a change thoroughly first. By her own count, that side work had pulled roughly 14 tons of short oak out of the mill's chipper stream over those 2 years, and brought in just under $40,000 before material and shop costs. Modest money by any measure, but steady, and built entirely on woods a sawmill couldn't sell an hour before she showed up with a trailer. She kept her own expanded seedling operation running on the same system the whole time. Propagation space nearly tripled from where she'd started, built for less than half what a commercial bench system would have cost her. Wade, back at the mill, started noticing the pattern before Ruth ever asked him to. Certain size ranges, the 18 to 24-inch pieces especially, kept disappearing from the reject pile, specifically into Ruth's trailer, load after load, while other awkward lengths sat untouched. He started setting those sizes aside as they came off the edger, sorted before they ever hit the general reject stack, instead of leaving Ruth to dig through the whole pile herself. The mill crew, without much ceremony about it, started calling that sorted stock Miller lengths, a shorthand that stuck around the yard long after anyone remembered exactly when it started. Almost 2 years after that first walk through the reject pile, Ruth pulled her trailer into the mill yard on an ordinary Tuesday morning to pick up another load. The pile she remembered from that first visit, chaotic, mixed, sprawling across half the yard, was gone. In its place stood a run of labeled stacks along the fence line, sorted by length and width, a hand-painted sign at the end of the row that just read Miller lengths in Wade's blocky handwriting. Wade walked over as she climbed down from the cab, nodding at the sorted stacks. "Made it easier on everybody," he said. "You get what you need faster. We stopped throwing good oak in the chipper. Seemed obvious once we started doing it." Ruth walked the row slowly, running a hand along a stack of 18-inch boards, then a stack of 24-inch, everything squared off and organized in a way the yard had never been on her first visit. The wood itself hadn't changed. It was the same short, solid oak it had always been, structurally sound, awkwardly sized. The kind of material that got dismissed as waste for years, before anyone bothered asking what it might actually be good for once you stopped trying to make it something else. What had changed was the system built around it, and standing there in the sorted yard, Ruth figured that was the part worth remembering.